Hi, Dean.
Hey, Brink, how you doing?
I'm doing well.
Okay.
Let's introduce ourselves for the Blogging Heads audience. I'm Brink Lindsey from the Kauffman Foundation.
I'm Dean Baker, the co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research.
And we are speaking to each other today on the eve of the apocalypse as Hurricane Irene winds its way up the East Coast.
Are you in D.C.?
I'm in D.C.
Oh, okay. So we're gonna go down together.
Yeah, indeed. And then we survived the earthquake earlier this week, so we're pinioned in between natural disasters and pinioned beneath an ongoing economic disaster. How's that for a segue?
Excellent segue. So the prospects of a double dip.
Yes, let's talk about that.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to be the optimist here. I just don't see the case for a double dip. As you probably know, I'm not in general an optimist on the economy, and I'm not going to say I'm too optimistic because I don't see a good picture. But in terms of the double dip story, I just really have a hard time seeing it. If you go, what typically gives you a recession? I mean, basic story, we're just talking about negative growth. You typically see a big fall off in construction, housing starts, and then on top of that, car sales. And the reason why I don't see that is they're both already at very, very low levels. So housing is already at pretty much the lowest level it's been. Housing starts since, I think you have to go back to the early 50s. I mean, we're at extremely low levels of construction. Sales aren't quite that low, but certainly construction, which is the big thing for GDP, that's already very low. Car sales have rebounded a little bit from where they were in 2009 and 2010. But we're still about 4 million below the sales rate, the pre-recession sales rate. So the idea that on those is going to turn negative in a big way is hard for me to see. And then absent that, we have very slow positives. We have consumption growing, not strongly, but, 1 to 2% a year. That's based on job growth of 1% a year, very weak. Lots of things to criticize there. It's way weaker than it should be. Right. But it's just very hard for me to see it go negative. So, I'm not a double dipper.
So this optimism is based on the theory that you can only kill a man or an economy once, and we're already dead. So you can't make us any deader.
That's pretty much the story, yeah. And I just, as I say, if you think carefully about it, it's a little hard for me to see what goes negative in this picture. So, and again, it's not much of a celebration. If we have 1 to 2% growth, people should be very upset because that's probably not even keeping pace with the growth of the labor force. We have to grow about 2.5% just to create enough jobs so that the unemployment rate doesn't get worse. So no one should celebrate 1 to 2% growth, but it is still positive. And I guess the reason why I don't like the double dip story is because you create a situation where if the counterfactual, if people will have in their heads we could have a double dip, then you turn around and you get this really weak growth, and they go, well, let's burn a double dip.
We avoid it, right?
Yeah.
Economic forecasting is not my bag, so I have nothing to say in terms of my own opinions because they're just based on what I read. But I think it's plausible to me that there are no kind of indigenous factors in the U.S. economy that have the oomph to propel us into another recession. What about, though, the prospect that the European situation takes a dramatic turn for the worse and we get caught up in contagion effects of that?
No, that's a very realistic story. And, I think the odds of that are low, but certainly not impossible. Because basically what you're seeing there is, you have this debt crisis with, originally just the smaller countries, Ireland and Greece, and then Portugal. But now it's spread to the larger countries, Spain and Italy. And if those countries were to default, then you're talking about a situation where certainly many, if not most, European banks are suddenly going to be insolvent. And it holds open the risk of a Lehman-type meltdown. So we could be back to where we were in the fall of '08, where the financial system just freezes up. People can't do normal business transactions. And if you go back then, of course, we're losing 700,000-800,000 jobs a month. That's a possibility, but you aren't going to find that in the growth dynamics of the U.S. economy. So I see that as a very real risk. And I think when we had the stock market plunges a couple of weeks ago, people were trying to connect that to the downgrade.
Mostly it was fears about Europe.
Yeah, that's right. And again, I think that's an unlikely situation, but not impossible. I'm saying it's unlikely because we know, the European Central Bank knows how to keep that from happening. But that doesn't mean you won't have a series of blunders, political obstacles where they basically can't do enough to paper things over to keep things going. Which
I don't know how to ascribe probabilities to a doomsday scenario in Europe, but it does seem to me that the risks are non-trivial,
right.
And in particular because it seems to me that the authorities there are in denial about the hopelessness of the Greek and maybe other countries' situations. That is, that they've been trying to just kick the can down the road, hope the economy picks up, and that ultimately reduces the scope of the problem. But it seems like Greece needs to default. Greece needs to write down a lot of its debt, and perhaps other countries do too. And that means then that European banks need to face and recognize and cope with a bunch of big write-downs. And the effort to kind of push this all off again and again and hope that somehow or another it goes away strikes me as a strategy that is not assured of success. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, Greece has a debt-to-GDP ratio now of about 150%. And, of course, the U.S., if we just look at the publicly held debt, which is usually what we talk about, it's somewhere around 70%. So we're talking about a country that has twice the ratio of debt to GDP as the U.S. And, there's no easy solution to that apart from some sort of write-down. And, again, that means...
And then supposing what really needs to happen does happen, that is that Greece defaults or leaves the euro. Who knows? Just really, that's such a weird, novel space that who knows how that all goes? Who knows what that does to risk perceptions elsewhere with respect to other countries' sovereign debts? And anyway, we're in very unpredictable and very scary territory.
Yeah, exactly.
When a shoe that looks like it's all about to drop, just hanging on to the little piggy toe, it's going to drop probably sooner or later, and then who knows what happens.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And again, you hope, you expect that, the European Central Bank and the other major actors in Europe are going to be on top of this. I mean, they have to understand the situation. There's just no way at this point they cannot have some understanding of it. And, it's fine to be optimistic, but, you can't just hope, everything turns out wonderful when, there's no reason on earth to think it will. So you hope that they're going to have plans for dealing with the default and trying to, basically shore up their bases so that you can say, okay, Greece has defaulted, and again, maybe there's a write-down, something comparable with Portugal, something comparable with Ireland, but you have some sort of mechanism to ensure that the fallout's contained. Otherwise, you do run the risk of, the real meltdown scenario. But, again, this is, we could say in retrospect they should have seen Lehman coming. Obviously, they didn't, but
right.
We've had that experience, so they should know now. You have to be prepared.
Well, we'll talk more about the Fed later, but another factor militating against a double dip or any kind of steep double dip is that the Fed could do more than it's doing. Bernanke said as much today, and so presumably, even if whatever factors are inhibiting more expansionary monetary policy today, in the face of a real severe second downturn, it seems possible and even probable that the Fed would do something to forestall a collapse. So we do have the Fed's latent powers also in the bank to guard against a second recession.
One hopes.
Yeah. So and let's say that the Fed pursues some sort of minimalistic approach that will stave off the worst, stave off outright deflation, but won't really pay attention to the second part of its dual mandate on employment. Then double dip or no double dip, we're stuck with 9% plus unemployment and and a really, really lousy economy, double dip or no double dip. So, like you said, it's not much optimism to say that we're probably going to avoid a double dip, because what we're in already is really atrocious.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and that's why, again, I've been unhappy with people focusing on the double dip. I don't know how many reporters, have asked me, oh, do you see a double dip? And I go, no, and then they go, you're an optimist. Well, not especially. I mean, it's, the point is we do have to focus on the problem that's actually in front of us, and, celebrating a story where for the foreseeable future we're going to have an unemployment rate that's above 9%. That's absolutely crazy, and it's one of these things I have to remind people. We passed the first stimulus package when George W. Bush was in the White House, and we had 4.8% unemployment.
Yes.
Yeah. And, in fairness, I mean, everyone expected to go higher, but nonetheless, the idea was you do not want unemployment rates of, 5.5%, 6%. That's what people were thinking at the time. That was considered a really bad thing. So now we're sitting here with 9% unemployment, and there's somehow an idea that we should consider that acceptable. And, that's condemning a lot of people to really awful experience. And it's just kind of amazing to me. You get this separation. I mean, I've got a job, you've got a job, but those of us who are making policy are sitting here with jobs, whereas we're talking about a lot of people that are desperate. Families are breaking up, they're losing their homes, they can't afford the rent. This is a real nightmare story. So it's not just, we'll just tough it out. I love that when people in our position say we'll tough it out. We're not going to be toughing it out. A lot of people who we don't know are going to be toughing it out, who have much worse circumstances than we do.
It's taxing our empathy, Dean.
Yes. We only have so much.
So what is to be done? You've got an interesting idea for how to nudge the unemployment rate down, even without a general resurgence in economic fortunes. And you have an even more interesting co-author in touting this idea with you. So tell me about that. Tell me about the idea, and tell me about how you and Kevin Hassett found each other on the same side of an economic policy issue.
Well, the idea of work sharing, that if we can't increase outputs, if you can't increase the size of the pie, we redivide the amount of work. So in principle, we have an economy that's below potential, somewhere around 6, 7, 8% below potential. I mean, it's a lot of waste we could be producing, we're not producing. But if for whatever reason we can't get the economy up there, we can't stimulate it through fiscal monetary policy, whether it's a political or economic obstacle, doesn't matter. Maybe what we could do is get people working. And the logic of work sharing is that right now we're in effect paying people to be unemployed. So we have unemployment compensation, and that's paying someone to be unemployed. And if someone's unemployed, I mean, I'm not a foe of unemployment compensation, but the point is that that is what we're in fact doing. The logic of work sharing is saying, well, rather than having the government give you a check for being unemployed, how about giving you a check to compensate for working short hours? So to sort of take a simple story, if you had a company that was going to lay off, say it employed 100 workers, is going to lay off 20 of them, 1/5 its workers, rather than laying off 1/5 of your workers and have them get half their pay for being unemployed, how about have everyone work 1/5 less? Have them work 32 hours a week rather than 40 hours a week. And we'll take the unemployment check that those people have gotten, and we'll use that to make up half of their shortfall in pay. So they'll work.
So that's the key to the plan, is to change unemployment compensation to be allowed to be used for shortfalls in employment rather than just 100% unemployment.
Yeah, that's the basic story. And we actually have work share programs, or short work is what they're called, in 20 states as part of their unemployment insurance systems. But the problem is that they're mostly put in place in the late 70s, early 80s, and they tend to be overly bureaucratic. So what you really have to do is ease up some of those rules. They also have to be publicized. I find out very few people even know, employers, even know about them. So you have to ease up on those rules some. But I think it can be done, and the model here is Germany. It's really a remarkable story. A lot of people look to Germany and say their economy is doing great, primarily because they have a low unemployment rate. Their unemployment rate is currently about a 0.5 percentage point lower today than it was at the start of the downturn. So it's quite a good story.
And what a weird turn of events that we're looking wistfully at relatively low Western European unemployment rates.
Yeah, no, it is quite striking because certainly that would not have been the case, 10 years ago or probably even 5 years ago. But yeah, no, it is quite striking to see that. But what's striking with Germany, it's not that their economy has done so well. Its growth has been only a little bit better than that of the U.S., and even that's only been recently. We actually had more rapid growth until I think the first quarter of this year. So it's not that their economy has grown more rapidly. It's rather that they've used work sharing very effectively. So they've gotten firms to keep their workers on the payroll rather than laying them off. So they keeps them employed, keeps them, up current in their skills. And what that also means, employers like this as well. It means that when demand expands, they need more work. They don't have to go out and look for new workers and train them. They're already on staff. So this has been a policy that in Germany, interestingly, was started by they had a coalition government a few years back with both the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats there, and it was a Social Democratic minister that was the big advocate of this. But it's been embraced by the Christian Democratic government that now rules by itself, and they're very strong advocates of it. So it's really something that, I think makes sense across the board. It's, and that's why, it's sort of interesting. Kevin Hassett, for people who aren't familiar with him, he's a conservative economist. He's one of the top advisors to the Republicans in Congress. He was John McCain's chief economic advisor when he ran for president in 2000. But he's a strong advocate of this for mostly the same reasons that I am. He just sees that, it's important to keep people employed, keep them, in the workforce, keep them learning skills, and avoid having this problem of people who are long-term unemployed, which in many cases they may never work again. So if we could find a way to do that, and one that really doesn't cost very much money, why on earth wouldn't you want to do that?
Along similar lines, I saw a post by Ryan Avent, who blogs for The Economist. He's currently reporting from the Lindau meeting in Germany. And he was reporting on a presentation by Chris Bessarides on the striking and perhaps surprising result that in Europe, at least, there is a inverse relation between hours worked per employee and employment to population ratio. So the higher the total hours per year worked per employee, the lower the employment to population ratio, which seems weird because you'd think the more people are working, they'd earn more, they'd have more demand, that would pump up employment. But what it seems to reflect is differential inhibitions and barriers to part-time work. So that in Greece, it's very difficult to hire part-time workers. And so as a result, they just load up more on their existing employees and leave other people just out of the workforce altogether. Whereas in the Netherlands, there's a lot of facilitation of part-time work, and they therefore have a higher overall employment to population ratio, and presumably productivity gains associated with that. So that's different from, I think, from what you're focusing on, which is the kind of rigidity of our current unemployment insurance system. Yeah. But it still goes to the issue that spreading work around can have unanticipated benefits.
That's very interesting. I'm curious, is that something that is that relationship that he was just looking at in the current downturn, or is that something he looked at through time? So in other words,
it's just a blog post. I'll put a link up to it. But I didn't see the presentation, so I don't know the details. Okay,
no, that'd be interesting because, I've had this discussion, of course, about short work with a lot of people, and people point to the experiment that France had, going to a 35-hour work week at the end of the 90s. And it is a fundamentally different situation, and not to say that necessarily France going to a 35-hour work week was the wrong thing to do. But these are sort of two different situations. So in the current situation, there are few people, there are some, but I think relatively few who dispute we're below full employment. So we have people who want to work, they have the skills, the ability. So if we had more demand, they would be working. So in that context, we're saying, okay, if we can't find the way to generate demand, can we divide up the work and get these people working? To my mind, that's a very hard thing to argue against, that, why on earth wouldn't you be able to do that? Now, there's another position that, and this gets back to the situation of France in the late 90s, arguably they were at full employment and they faced structural obstacles to lowering their unemployment rate. I personally don't agree with that view, but people are arguing that. So in that context, the argument was, well, if you try to reduce work hours per worker, you're simply going to end up with an inflationary situation because really there's structural obstacles to lowering the unemployment rate. So what you're talking about refers to those structural obstacles, or could. I mean, again, neither of us have seen the actual paper, so we're speaking partly of ignorance, but it might address these issues of what those structural obstacles look like. My own view of the story of France is it was a mixed bag. It didn't produce as much employment as its proponents had hoped for, but it didn't lead to a lot of inflation either. Interestingly, what it actually led to was a big increase in productivity growth, which, I considered a good thing. I mean, if you could shorten the work week and knock up productivity by 2 or 3 percentage points, what's the bad part? What's the bad part of that story? But in any case, it's an interesting paper. I look forward to looking at it.
Yeah, unsurprisingly, I took a dim view of the French shortened work week, precisely for the reasons you mentioned, that it seemed to me that high unemployment was at that point endemic, not only in France but in many Western European countries. Even with sound and robust GDP growth, they were still stuck near double-digit unemployment, which seemed to me to reflect structural barriers and problems in labor markets, and also problems with the design of social benefits that needed to be addressed because long-term unemployment or long-term depressed employment is a human tragedy, and it struck me that papering over it by trying to spread work around was defeatism rather than really tackling the root of the problem. So I wasn't especially interested in the possible inflationary consequences. I was just concerned that it reflected an attempt to skirt the main issues that were facing the economy.
Okay, well, I'll let you go with France.
Yeah, but at any rate, we're in a different situation here. This is I don't have settled opinions about your proposal, but it strikes me as a very different kettle of fish than a kind of a long-term plan to shorten the work week. This is a response to a gap between actual and potential GDP, and in particular, it's making unemployment insurance more work-friendly, and that improving incentives to work strikes me as a nice idea.
Oh, good. No, I agree, and again, I'm more sympathetic to that as shortening the work week as a long-term issue as well. But in any case, the immediate point is to get people working today, and so. So let me ask a skeptical question about this. Well, first, do you have in your analysis, have you tried to estimate what the effects of your proposal would be on productivity, on the productivity situation? I haven't, and it really would just be shooting in the dark, I think, at this point, because when you're in a situation where there is so much slack in the economy, productivity really does jump around. And of course, we saw that at the start of the downturn. People were shocked at these huge surges in productivity. And, what I thought at the time, and, it turns out to have been vindicated, it was just a question of timing. So what you had at the start of the downturn was it looked like we had this sort of extraordinary productivity growth, and people were saying, wow, employers are able to raise their productivity growth in downturn.
Right.
Well, they just laid people off very quickly. And then subsequently, of course, we have had way below trend productivity growth for the last 4 or 5 quarters. But if you put it together, it's more or less evens out. So I guess I wouldn't be that worried. I'm just saying, A, I couldn't tell you how it would affect productivity, but B, I wouldn't be that concerned because I don't think it would be the long-term story. So, let's say that we have a work share program in place for, 2 or 3 years in a big way. I mean, you don't have to get rid of it, but, presumably it becomes less important when we get down to more normal levels of unemployment. So let's say we have it in place for 2 or 3 years, and during that time, it has a negative effect on measured productivity. But then as we start to get back to normal levels of unemployment, then, work share becomes less important. It really doesn't matter that much. So I don't know which way it's likely to go, which isn't to say that I expect it to be bad for productivity. I'm just saying, I don't think we have enough basis to really say But as long as we're in a period where the economy's main problem is insufficient demand, I don't think productivity is that big an issue.
Yeah, it's. I raise this because there's a kind of grim analysis that's nonetheless, I think, worth thinking about, and that is this whole idea of zero marginal productivity workers, an idea that Tyler Cowen did something to popularize on his blog. And basically it was an idea that was cooked up to explain this big productivity surge in the teeth of the recession, much of which has now been wiped out by subsequent revisions to GDP data.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, there is something weird and new in the last couple of recessions. It used to be that productivity was quite strongly pro-cyclical, and now it's starting to look somewhat or counter-cyclical. And maybe that's muted now by the GDP revisions, but still, I think something changed. The whole character of recessions has changed from how they used to be in mid-century through the 80s, and as opposed to the last three. And one theory to account for this is that workers or that employers are taking the opportunity of downturns to clear decks and get rid of their worst employees, and that's also explains why we have such long-term unemployment these days compared to previous recessions. Is that these folks just don't have the skills to be employed anywhere, which is, as I said, a grim and kind of heartless analysis. But if it were true, then perhaps spreading the work around isn't such a great idea if these workers don't really belong and aren't really adding value to their current places of employment.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I'm a little skeptical of that. First off, you find the normal patterns that the people who are being laid off, being dismissed from the workplace, are overwhelmingly younger workers. So it's quite striking that, the people who stay on are older workers. I've had some back and forth with a few economists on this, that, the unemployment rate for older workers has risen, but not anywhere near as much as for younger workers. It's a little hard for me to believe that all the bad workers are younger workers. I think the basic story is simply that if you look at prior downturns, we had much more heavily unionized workforce, and even where we didn't have unions, there was much more of a norm that you don't just dump your workers when things get bad. So employers were willing to hold on to workers for through a downturn, and recognize that they don't have to, they wouldn't fully be utilizing their labor. They'll be having them sit around a lot. And this time that wasn't true. Some of that I think was, less unions, and the erosion of the norm, but some of it I think was probably quite practical. We literally were in a free fall. If you go back to October, November, December of '08 and the first few months of '09, I mean, we were in a free fall, and you had some companies, of course, going out of business. They don't have any choice but to lay off the workers. But, in a lot of other cases, they weren't sure about their financing. Their markets were disintegrating. So basically, they had to get rid of every expense they could, really out of desperation. So I'd be a little hesitant to assume that that's going to be a general pattern. I guess I should say I sure hope we don't see another recession like this one.
Yeah, I will say I don't put much stock in the zero marginal productivity worker theory, but I thought it was at least worth throwing out there. So to me, this work sharing proposal could do some good. It could knock down the unemployment rate a bit. Even now, right? Even after the surge in unemployment, we still are constantly having a churn of new hires and new fires. So if you could dampen the extent of the new fires, then you could work down the unemployment rate from where we are now through introduction of this proposal. That's the idea.
Exactly. That's a very important point, because I had several economists who said, well, this might have been a good idea back when we were losing 600,000 jobs a month, but now when it's more or less stabilized, we're adding 100,000, it's too late. And I look at it and go, well, every month we have roughly 2 million workers that involuntarily lose their job. They're either they're dismissed, or some of them are fired. And if you could reduce that, let's say you could reduce that by 10%. I don't know if that's a realistic number, but just to throw that out there, if you reduce that by 10%, that's the same thing as creating 200,000 jobs a month. So if you could do this effectively, it could have a very big impact on employment. So
let's say let's just assume this is a great idea, but it's a great idea for a palliative, right? It's a great idea for how to ride through the current bad times in as good order as possible.
So you want to get to the Fed.
The fundamental question is, how do we get out of these bad times? And my vote for the number one thing that could be done to revive our economic fortunes is for Ben Bernanke to do what he kept telling the Bank of Japan to do all through the 90s, which is to use the available powers of the central bank to keep nominal spending somewhere near trend growth, which is the Fed has manifestly failed to do. I think we're about 12% below the trend line of pre-recession growth in nominal GDP.
That sounds about right. I've been scared to look, though.
And that's a pretty dramatic shortfall. And I think there are, and I think it's at the heart of much of our current funk. There may very well be structural barriers as well. I'm sure there are. I think I can think of all kinds of policy proposals that I think would make the economy run more efficiently and more dynamically. But nonetheless, it seems to me we have a big fat aggregate demand problem. And I go along with the economics consensus of the past 20 years that aggregate demand problems are monetary policy problems, not primarily fiscal policy programs or problems. We kind of jumped all that out the window over the past couple of years as interest rates got near zero. People just sort of seem to forget that the Fed could do other things besides manipulate the Fed funds rate, and threw all of their weight behind fiscal policy as a stimulus. But I'm a believer that the Fed has control over nominal spending. It could prop it up if it wanted to, and it's choosing not to. But let me say I think there's that case, there's that position which I have come to under the influence of Scott Sumner, who's at Bentley University and who blogs regularly at the Money Illusion, and who is the perhaps most prominent of a group of people who call themselves quasi-monetarists or new monetarists or something like that, but who basically see the current output gap as a problem of too contractionary monetary policy.
So what specifically would you have the Fed do?
So Sumner argues that the ideal solution over time is to target nominal GDP levels, so that if you have a shortfall, you'll make it up next go around.
So what does that mean? So in effect, that's in a sense targeting inflation. If you don't have the real GDP, in other words, so currently Bernanke's still adhering sort of to the 2% inflation target.
If you announce a clear commitment, the Fed is going to do everything it can do to ensure 4 to 5% nominal GDP growth, which breaks down to 2% inflation and 2 to 3% real GDP growth under normal circumstances. That's his proposed gold standard, to be ironic, for monetary policy.
It's very funny because I don't know if you're familiar with this, but Bernanke himself wrote this paper back when he was still at Princeton in 99 or 2000 about Japan. Japan's downturn. Okay. So he didn't put it in terms of targeting nominal GDP. He put it in terms of targeting inflation, but the two end up being the same, more or less. I mean,
more or less.
Yeah.
Sumner says that inflation is so devilishly hard to measure, whereas nominal spending, we know what it is, and it's the basis of everyone's expectations, and so that's the better target. So that's one reason to think that the Fed should be doing more monetary stimulus, is if you're in this kind of monetarist camp where you think this is all really a monetary policy problem. But there are other bases for thinking that monetary stimulus right now is a good idea. One of them is if you buy the Ken Rogoff, Carmen Reinhart theory of the current recession, which is it's one of these post-financial crises recessions, which are particularly ghastly and particularly long lasting in their effects because of all the deleveraging that has to occur in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And he argues that that deleveraging process, which is going to be painful and long in any event, can still be accelerated by a little dose of inflation. So you can come at this from another angle and think that goosing up inflation for a while would be a very good idea under these specific circumstances. Finally, even if you're just an old school, the Fed should target 2% inflation, and that's all it should do, and it shouldn't care one bit about its supposed other half of its mandate on employment, then the fact is that since the end of 2008, core inflation has been under 2%. And according to Sumner, he did calculations for market-based inflationary expectations looking at the TIPS market, at the inflation-protected Treasury securities. And he calculates that market expectations of inflation 2.5 years out are a smidge over 1%.
That's right.
So that puts us smack dab in the middle of a 5-year period of failing to meet the 2% inflation target, sub-target. So even if, so the only policy goal that meshes with this track record is one where the Fed has a dual mandate to control inflation and to maximize unemployment, which clearly is not a good idea.
No, I'm really glad to hear you say this. I mean, this is very much I've been arguing similar things, and it's good to hear you saying this coming from a somewhat different perspective, but coming to the same conclusion. It's very hard to understand why the Fed would be doing anything other than trying to boost the economy at this point. Because
so if you just switched to price level targeting and stuck with your 2% plan, but targeted the level rather than the rate, where every time you fail to meet your target, you just forget about it and start over. Whereas if you targeted the level, then if you had a shortfall in one quarter or 1 year, you would be committed to making up for it in the subsequent period. That would be tons better than where we are right now. But where we are right now, they're uniformly failing to meet what they consider to be price stability, and price stability is considered to be 2% inflation, which means that sub 2% inflation is considered to be deflationary, and yet they're sticking with it, and they seem blandly complacent about it. So Bernanke gave his speech today. We're talking on Friday at the Jackson Hole conference, and he said we're not going to do anything. The ball's in Congress's court to do fiscal policy stimulus. We're not going to do anything more right now, although we could if we wanted to. He said, we've got additional arrows in the quiver, but right now this is Congress's problem, not ours, which strikes me as an abdication, although we can talk about why he's doing this.
No, I agree with you 100% on that. I mean, it's the Fed, it's unfortunate that Congress isn't doing more. I'd like to see more fiscal policy. Again, absent getting the economy going, as I say, I have my work share, plan that, at least get people to work. But in principle, we don't want to waste, we don't want to have this waste. We could productively produce things that people value. We should be doing that, and fiscal policy has a role to play. But again, absent whether or not Congress are doing that, I'd say, given where the economy is today, certainly Fed should be pushing much, much harder than it is. I think, you raised at the end, why is it not? And I think that's kind of a fascinating story because, we have, to my mind, sort of a wrong-headed view that the Fed is removed from politics. And I think we see very clearly, today at least, that it's not because I don't really know Bernanke. I mean, I guess I met him a couple times, so I wouldn't claim to know him. But, just based on his writings, I think he probably would agree with most of what you just said. He certainly would seem to be coming from that perspective. But here he is basically saying, we're going to sit here with our arms folded and just wait to see if Congress does anything. And
so why doesn't the Fed do more? One theory is that Bernanke just disagrees with what I've just said. But clearly many brilliant economists who specialize in monetary policy, and I'm not an economist and I don't specialize in monetary policy, so they know more than I do. Plenty of them think that further monetary stimulus right now wouldn't produce much in the way of benefits and carries with it very real risks of inflation down the road, and that inflation, once sort of released from the genie's bottle, is very hard to put back in. So there is this idea of just sort of substantive policy disagreement. In Bernanke's case, I just don't believe that's the case, because it would require him to basically think differently from how he thought in the late 90s or early 00s when he was lecturing the Bank of Japan to be more activist.
Exactly.
But there clearly is, inflation hawkishness elsewhere on the FOMC, the Open Market Committee, and as evidenced by their most recent announcement when they said they were going to keep, they tweaked their statement of keeping rates low to what was it, like for at least for
2 years,
two more years rather than for the foreseeable future. And that very nuanced, subtle tweak in the direction of being somewhat more expansionary elicited 3 dissenting votes on the FOMC from inflation hawk.
And that's extraordinary because people may not realize it's unusual. I mean, every now and then you get a lone dissenting vote. People feel strongly about that and they cast a lone dissenting vote. I mean, everyone knows whether something's going through or not because they just discussed it. So they know, they know where the votes are going to be. So if you feel, strongly, you go ahead and issue a dissenting vote even though you know you're going to lose. To have 3 dissenting votes, I mean, you'd have to look back. I don't follow all their votes all that closely, but you might have to look back two or 3 decades to find another situation where you have 3 dissenting votes. And given that this really was a very modest measure, that's pretty.
I don't know anything about the track record of dissents, but I do have the general impression that the Fed has tried to operate, with on as much of a consensus basis as possible, and so it's at least that tradition which Bernanke has partially broken with by taking a course of action that brought on 3 dissents. But still, I think that in the face of substantive disagreement about monetary policy, a tradition of some kind of consensus is an inhibitor on Bernanke. But another, I think, important inhibitor on Bernanke is, as you mentioned, politics. That inflation phobia is not only alive and well, at the Fed. It's the dominant ideology amongst conservatives and Republicans, and as evidenced by Rick Perry's equation of monetary stimulus with treason a week or 2 ago, and as evidenced by the Fed bashing that it's debasing our currency, et cetera, that comes out of that's associated with the Tea Party wing of the Republican Party.
No, I think that's exactly right, and I think.
And so you see the hullabaloo that was caused by quantitative easing, or QE2, which was pretty weak tea. Then you can imagine that the Fed has legitimate fears for its long-term independence if it were to do novel stuff and quantitative easing and doing building up its balance sheet and doing the kinds of things you have to do when interest rates are already near zero. They're novel. They're not its wheelhouse. And so doing those novel things, and if they didn't work out well, then you can picture the Fed being quite fearful that the political firestorm might consume it.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And this is where, I think it's very unfortunate that the Obama administration didn't try and lay a basis, a framework in which Bernanke could go that direction. Now, he can't get out. I mean, he could get out there and say, "Oh, Bernanke should do that." I don't think that'd be a productive thing to do because that might actually make it more difficult. But to try and set up an intellectual framework in which, it could be understood. Here's why the Fed has to act. Here are their tool sets. Here's precedent for it. You can find precedent, to make it possible. But I think
the administration also had Fed vacancies that it displayed absolutely no urgency in filling.
Just incredible. I mean, here you have, incredibly important positions. We have 7 members, the governors that are appointed by the president. Five of the other voting members, the Open Market Committee, are bank presidents. Those aren't appointed by the president. But he does appoint 7 members, and he's sitting there with 2 vacancies. Now, we all know he's going to have a hard time getting them through Congress, but if you don't even put names up, you obviously can't get them through. And it really is just, I really don't have an explanation as to what they could have been thinking, that they weren't trying to, get someone up there, get them through. And, I know the Republicans are being obstructionists. We all know that. But, you can't blame them for being obstructionists if you don't give them something to obstruct.
So I am personally of the view that misplaced inflation phobia is and its manifestation in political sentiment and in the opinions of people in the Fed is the number one problem with our economy right now, because it is preventing the most efficacious steps that could be taken to revive our economic fortunes. And I would say that just looking historically, there's nothing new about this. So we see, we're scratching our heads. Bernanke knew what was going on in Japan. Why isn't he doing anything now? But the fact is, when you're in the middle of macroeconomic calamity that has monetary roots, it's very hard for even the smartest people to see that that's what's going on. In the 1930s, you had, the general idea that there was just overproduction and the general glut. And it wasn't until, I think, the early 60s when Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz wrote their Monetary History of the United States that they really nailed down and started changing the consensus within the economics profession of monetary roots of the Great Depression. Likewise, during the stagflation experience of the 70s, lots and lots of smart economists just didn't see inflation as a monetary phenomenon at all. They thought it was this wage price spiral, and it was sort of an endemic problem of the welfare state, and it needed to be managed through incomes policy and price controls, but monetary policy couldn't possibly be the answer until it was. And so I fear that we're once again in the middle of one of these downturns that has monetary roots, and 20, 30 years from now, the consensus of economic opinion will be, yep, that was a monetary problem and really should have done something about it at the time. And they'll pat themselves on the back for seeing it. But then, the next downturn, amnesia seems to return. So, I see this as a recurring blindness.
Well, I don't know if I go with you on saying it's all monetary, but I will certainly agree that monetary policy has an important role to play that in this particular case it is not being exercised. And, to what extent...
No, I wouldn't say it's all monetary either. I'm just saying that's that it's an important role in what's going on, and a widely underappreciated role in what's going on.
Absolutely. So I think we might be going into overtime here. So
yeah, you want to switch gears and just speak a few minutes about the super committee and what's going to come out of resolving our long-term debt problems?
Sure. Let me start off on that. I have to say I'm not a big deficit hawk. I think that a lot of the deficit stories have been misrepresented. First off, the current deficit, the idea that this is due to out-of-control spending, it's easy to see. We did not have large deficits until the downturn, and we didn't get the deficits in the downturn because President Obama said, I've got 1,000 great new social programs. We got deficits in the downturn because, one, tax collections collapsed, and two, we had a huge increase in transfer payments, things like not Social Security, unemployment benefits, food stamps. And, of course, we did have deliberate stimulus, but that was done as countercyclical policy. So in terms of, sort of programs that are there for the long term, you have very little you could point to. It certainly didn't get us to deficits of 10% of GDP. So the short-term story is a story of, an economic downturn. It's not a story of, crazy out-of-control spending. The longer term, we do have problems, and people focus, the arguments, entitlements, and concretely at Social Security and Medicare. I think a lot of people don't know entitlements are Social Security and Medicare, but that's really what we're talking about. Yes. And there are two different stories there. Social Security, we do have an aging population that does cost more. A lot of that's already been provided for, at least within the accounting and the program, so we have a surplus, but that's projected, at least according to the Congressional Budget Office, to run out as of 2038, at which point we face a shortfall. That's an issue, but I don't think it's a huge issue. I just did a calculation the other day. If you said, suppose we want to make it solvent through its 75-year planning period, and you did it all on the revenue side, the tax side, the tax increase you'd need to keep it fully solvent over that period is equal to 5% of projected wage growth. So, you could argue whether that's a lot, a little, but it's, that doesn't seem an insoluble problem. And obviously it doesn't all have to be done on the tax side. My inclination would be that direction, but that doesn't really matter. It just gives you a sense of the size of the problem. In terms of Medicare, our problem with Medicare, the costs go through the roof, but that's our private healthcare system. So if you look at the projections, they're driven by projections of exploding private sector healthcare costs that are really frightening. I mean, if you look out, I just did the calculation the other day. If you look out what they project the cost of providing care for someone who's 85 in 2050, it would be, I believe it was $80,000 a year. That's in 2011 dollars. So these are just kind of incredible numbers. Now, if you're paying for that through Medicare, well, that creates a big budget problem, you know. But the real story is we have these costs that are just way out of line with everyone else in the world. They're way out of line with Canada, with Germany, with, you know, whoever you want to compare us to. And we don't really have anything obvious to show for it in terms of better health care outcomes.
Yeah, our levels are way out of whack, absolutely. But growth rates everywhere are all along the same level. We're starting from a much higher base.
Actually, no. I mean, if you look at that, our growth is more rapid than most of them, too. So if you look back to 1970, and I did this not too long ago, we're right in the middle. I mean, we're above the average, but we are not the top. And
right.
It's really been in the period from 1970 till 2000 or so that we just, you know, we're not just at the top. We're like way over the top.
Right. So anyway, I will agree that the main problem in our long-term fiscal lack of sustainability is Medicare, and that is primarily a healthcare policy problem. But it is a problem, and it is likely. It seems that growing demand for healthcare is pretty deeply wired into the American system right now, which means that other programs may very likely have to give way, including Social Security, including defense, to keep. To make room for healthcare expenses within the constraints imposed by the American public's appetite for paying taxes. So I don't know what the long-term shakeout is going to be, but what I know is that we've seen this kind of the unsustainability of our spending and revenue paths for quite some time now, and yet the fact is that we are in a political equilibrium where the American people want more government than they want to pay for. So whenever anyone proposes restraints on Medicare, they get demonized, as the Republicans did in '95, as Obama did with death panels, and the Senior Bill of Rights being touted by the Republicans in 2008 and 2009. And meanwhile, if anybody proposes big tax increases to safeguard the healthcare and other entitlement status quo, they get eaten alive politically. So the political incentives are all to build up debt. That's the way to maintain this. And yet, it looks like at some point that fudge is going to be exhausted, and we seem to be approaching that point. I don't have a whole lot of enthusiasm or a whole lot of optimism that the super committee is going to be the magic formula for resolving this very deep-seated incoherence in American public opinion. But it's one step along the way of what I think will be a long-term process of figuring out whether we prefer our relatively low taxes or whether we prefer our relatively lavish healthcare spending.
Well, I see a couple of things a little differently. First off, I do think we have much, much more room. So if you look at debt to GDP ratios in the U.S. compared to other countries, you know, say Japan, if you want to pick the real outlier there, which is, you know, more than double what we are. Yep. We have a long, long way to go. And still has very low interest rates, too. I mean, lots of complaints you can say about Japan's economy, but they don't have a problem financing their debt, so it's not an issue. And also what we've had historically, of course, we had considerably higher debt to GDP ratios just after World War II. So I don't think we're approaching, you know, any sort of real constraints there. Not to say we never would, but I think they're somewhat distant. But the other point I say, getting back to the healthcare issue, I don't see it so much as people demanding healthcare as that you have a dysfunctional system. So they want the outcomes, they don't necessarily want the expense, and we have the expense because we have an incredibly corrupt system.
Right, but they, just recall the town hall meetings of
no, people can be easily scared. No, but I'll tell you the way
they like their system, and any attempts to impose any kind of restraint on how much that system pays drives people
easily
crazy.
Scared because they don't really understand the system, and they don't know where the expenses are. People aren't healthcare policy wonks, so they don't know where their money's going. They want to know that they can go to a doctor they're choosing when they need to. There's a lot of things here that people don't understand because they end up being complicated quite deliberately. Now, I think the way around this is actually, it's not something I'm necessarily that happy about the way it happened in the auto industry, but it did happen in the auto industry. The way you got you got GM, Ford, and Chrysler to build better cars, and ultimately you got much lower pay for the United Auto Workers, not something I'm particularly happy about, but it happened, was through foreign competition.
Yeah.
And I think we are going to see that. You are seeing that to some extent with healthcare, and I think you'll see a lot more because the price differentials are so enormous that you are going to see people going to, whether it's Western Europe or in many cases Western facilities in the developing world, taking advantage of the fact that you could get healthcare for much lower prices. I'm not thinking people are going to go to, for a checkup to a doctor in India, but there are already facilities that provide healthcare services at, a tiny fraction of the cost of U.S. facilities. Something as someone who needs major heart surgery that might cost you $250,000 in a U.S. hospital. You can go to a Western quality hospital in India or Thailand and maybe have the same procedure for $20,000, $30,000, $40,000. You've got $200,000 sitting on the table. Cover your airfare, your family's fare, stay in a hotel.
A week at the beach down in Thailand, in Phuket, and you're still even.
Exactly. So I think you are going to see a lot more of that, and I would actually like to facilitate that. I mean, I have to say, I think it's crazy. I think it's crazy people might go halfway around the world to get care. But given the power of the healthcare industry to prevent reform, that they could scare people, exactly as you said, then I think the only option may be to go through the route of globalization, through trade. And in that way, basically open, allow people to see, it can be done much more cheaply. And B, if you get a lot of these procedures, if you get a lot of people going elsewhere for their care, that's going to reduce demand substantially here, and it will put some serious downward pressure on costs in the system.
Oh, I agree with you, and I think this is a good turn in the conversation, particularly since we're late in the hour, rather than steering into an intractable headbutting about the size and structure of the welfare state. It's nice to end on a note of common ground, which is that a major, and I know you've written extensively about this, a major factor in our obscenely inflated healthcare spending figures is real constraints on supply, and in particular the cartelistic protection of doctors from competition, and relaxing those constraints either domestically through broadening what non-MDs can do and are totally well qualified to do, or through greater immigration, or through, as you mentioned, this new arising possibility of trade. All of those are steps in the right direction.
Yeah, no, 100% agreement on that. Brink, we agree on too much stuff. We have to find things we disagree on.
Yeah, we'll it's really not a problem, I don't think, Dean. But we stumbled into a whole bog of agreement here, and we'll work our way out the next time we meet here.
Sounds good.
Very nice talking to you, and hope you survive the hurricane.
Yeah, you too. Good luck riding it out.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.